I used to think that my apartment was the safest place on earth. It was a small, cozy place with just enough room for me and my cat. I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with living alone, but little did I know that things were about to take a turn for the worst. It started with a shadow in the corner of my bedroom. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every night, it was there, looming in the darkness. It was a tall, thin figure that seemed to blend in with the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it soon became impossible. I could feel it watching me, even when I wasn't looking at it directly. It filled me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. Then, things started to get even stranger. Objects around the apartment began to move on their own. I would put something down on the table, and it would end up on the floor on the other side of the room. The cat started acting strange too, hissing at nothing and hiding under the bed for hours at a time. I was too scared to sleep at night, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't afford to move out, and I didn't want to involve anyone else in my problem. I started to feel like I was going crazy, like I was the only one who could see the shadow and the strange things that were happening. One night, I decided to confront the shadow. I got out of bed and walked over to the corner of the room where it always appeared. As I got closer, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The shadow was darker than ever before, and I could feel a cold breeze coming from it. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt like I was suffocating, like the shadow was sucking the air out of my lungs. Then, it spoke. The voice was deep and menacing, and it filled me with a sense of dread that I had never felt before. "I have been watching you," it said. "I have been waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to scream, to call for help, but I was paralyzed with fear. The shadow continued to speak, its voice growing louder and more insistent. It told me things that I didn't want to hear, things that made me want to cover my ears and close my eyes. "You cannot escape me," it said. "I am always here, waiting for you. You belong to me, and there is nothing you can do about it." That night, I barely slept. I spent hours huddled under the covers, trying to block out the sound of the shadow's voice. But even when it was silent, I could still feel its presence in the room. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge and afraid. I decided to do some research to find out if anyone else had ever experienced something like this before. It didn't take me long to find stories of other people who had encountered shadow figures in their homes. Some of them had even managed to get rid of them, using rituals and prayers to banish the darkness. I decided to try some of these methods for myself. I spent hours researching different spells and incantations, trying to find one that felt right. Finally, I found one that seemed promising. It involved lighting candles and saying a special prayer, and I felt like it was the right thing to do. That night, I lit the candles and recited the prayer. At first, nothing happened. The shadow was still there, looming in the corner of my room. But then, something changed. The air in the room grew warmer, and the shadows began to recede. As I continued to recite the prayer, the shadow grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a small, black dot on the wall. And then, just like that, it was gone. I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The cat came out from under the bed, and I knew that things were going to be okay. But even though the shadow was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. I slept with the lights on for weeks, afraid that it would come back. And even now, years later, I still can't bring myself to go back to that apartment. I don't know if the shadow is still there, waiting for me. But I do know that I will never forget the terror that it brought into my life. I've always been fascinated by ghost stories, but I never thought that I would experience one firsthand. That all changed when I moved into a new house on the outskirts of town. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. But it had a certain charm to it, and I was excited to make it my own. I spent hours painting the walls and arranging furniture, making it feel like home. But as soon as the sun went down, things started to change. I would hear strange noises in the middle of the night, like footsteps walking through the hallways and doors creaking open and shut. At first, I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but things only got worse from there. Objects around the house began to move on their own, and the air grew colder and colder as the night went on. I tried to ignore it, but it soon became impossible. I was too scared to sleep at night, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't afford to move out, and I didn't want to involve anyone else in my problem. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape from. One night, I decided to investigate the strange noises. I grabbed a flashlight and walked through the house, trying to find the source of the sounds. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a faint whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sent chills down my spine. I turned the corner and saw a shadowy figure in the distance. It was hard to make out, but it seemed like a woman in a white dress. I tried to call out to her, but she disappeared before I could get closer. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was seeing things that weren't really there. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease. I knew that something was wrong with the house, that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. I decided to do some research to find out if anyone else had ever experienced something like this before. I talked to the neighbors, but they didn't have any answers for me. They told me that the house had been vacant for years, that no one had lived there since the last owner had passed away. But then, I found a local historian who knew the history of the house. He told me that it had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy family, but tragedy had struck when the daughter of the family had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. It was said that her ghost still haunted the house, unable to find peace. And as soon as I heard that, I knew that it was true. I had seen her with my own eyes, and I could feel her presence every time I was in the house. I knew that I had to do something to put her spirit to rest. I spent hours researching different methods, trying to find one that would work. Finally, I found an old ritual that involved burning sage and saying a special prayer. I was skeptical, but I didn't have any other options. That night, I lit the sage and recited the prayer. At first, nothing happened. The house was still and quiet, as it had been for weeks. But then, something changed. The air in the house grew warmer, and the shadows began to recede. I could feel the presence of the ghost growing weaker and weaker. As I continued to recite the prayer, the ghost appeared in front of me. She was no longer the shadowy figure that I had seen before, but a solid, tangible presence. She looked at me with sad eyes, and I could feel the weight of her grief and pain. I knew that I had to help her find peace, and I begged for forgiveness on behalf of whoever had caused her death. And then, something miraculous happened. The ghost smiled at me, a small, sad smile, and then disappeared. The house was filled with warmth and light, and I knew that the haunting was finally over. From that day on, I was able to sleep peacefully in the house. I no longer heard strange noises, and the air was no longer cold and oppressive. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and the house was finally at peace. I never forgot about the ghost, though. Every once in a while, I would see her in my dreams, and I knew that she was watching over the house, protecting it from harm. And so, I lived in the house for many years, content in the knowledge that I had helped a lost soul find peace. It was a scary experience, but it taught me that sometimes even the most frightening things can be overcome with a little bit of courage and faith. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural until the night I met the Shadow Man. It was a warm summer evening, and I was walking home from a friend's house. I took a shortcut through the park, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. But as I walked, I started to feel uneasy. It was as if someone was watching me, following me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I tried to shake off the feeling and picked up my pace, but it only got worse. I could hear footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, no one was there. And then, I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure, lurking in the darkness. He had no features, no face, no clothes. Just a shape, a presence. I froze, my heart racing. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The Shadow Man started to move towards me, his presence growing stronger and stronger. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the Shadow Man. It could have been seconds, minutes, hours. But eventually, he disappeared, leaving me alone in the park. I ran home, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as my imagination. But the Shadow Man didn't leave me alone. Over the next few weeks, I saw him again and again. In the park, outside my house, at school. He was always there, watching me. I tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. His presence was too strong, too overwhelming. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I became obsessed with the Shadow Man. I did research, trying to find out what he was, where he came from. But there was nothing. No one had ever seen anything like him before. And then, one night, I decided to confront him. I went to the park, where I had first seen him. I stood in the same spot, waiting for him to appear. And he did. The Shadow Man emerged from the darkness, his presence filling the air. I didn't know what to do, so I started to talk to him. I asked him what he wanted, why he was following me. And then, something strange happened. The Shadow Man started to speak. His voice was deep and distorted, but I could make out the words. He told me that he was a spirit, a being that had been trapped in the shadows for centuries. He had been watching me, drawn to my energy, my vitality. I was terrified, but also fascinated. The Shadow Man was like nothing I had ever encountered before. He asked me if I wanted to join him to become a part of his world. And I was tempted. The idea of leaving behind my mundane life, of entering a world of darkness and mystery, was thrilling. But then, something changed. The Shadow Man's presence grew stronger, more malevolent. He started to move towards me, his shadowy arms reaching out. I knew that I had to leave. I turned and ran, my heart racing. I could feel the Shadow Man's presence behind me, chasing me. I don't know how I made it home. I don't remember anything after that. But when I woke up the next morning, the Shadow Man was gone. I never saw him again after that night. But his presence stayed with me for years. I became obsessed with the supernatural, with the idea that there were things in the world that we couldn't explain. And even now, years later, I still feel his presence sometimes. It's as if he's waiting for me, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to come back to him. But I know that I can never go back to the Shadow Man. I can never let him consume me, never let him drag me into his world of darkness. I've learned that sometimes it's better to let go of the things that scare us, to walk away from the things that threaten to consume us. And so, I continue to live my life, always watching for the shadows, always aware of the things that lurk just out of sight. Because even though the Shadow Man may be gone, I know that there are other spirits out there, waiting for their chance to draw us into their world of darkness and mystery. And I know that I can never let my guard down, that I must always be vigilant, always watching, always waiting for the next encounter with the supernatural. Because in the end, the world is a strange and mysterious place, full of wonders and terrors beyond our wildest dreams. And it's up to us to navigate our way through the darkness, to find the light that will guide us back to safety.